Everybody. It's our pleasure at Sarasota Audubon to welcome Chris Wood. It's just great to have him. He's right here in Manatee County, and you might encounter him anywhere looking for birds anytime, right, Chris? Anytime in this area.
Absolutely.
Tonight, he's going to talk to us about eBird data collection and analysis. So Chris Wood is managing director of the Avian Population Studies and director of eBird at Cornell. And he will describe how the data is collected via thousands of bird watchers like all of us around the world, how it's gathered and how it's interpreted. So Chris was one of the developers and proponents of eBird, which has become, as I'm sure you all know, a major source of biodiversity data, increasing our knowledge of the dynamics of species distributions and for having a direct impact on the conservation of birds and their habitats. So Chris works with diverse teams around the world, conservation biologists, quantitative ecologists, statisticians, computer scientists, GIS and informatics specialists, application developers, data administrators, and expert bird watchers like all of us that have enabled eBird to reach a global audience. I can't thank you enough personally. eBird is so important to me, and I think to any of us that are trying to figure out where we want to go next and how to list what we've found. So I welcome you, Chris. Take it away.
Margie, thank you so much, and I'd like to thank the nearly 100 others who've joined this evening. It's really fun, for me to be able to spend some time down here. The circumstances probably couldn't be worse to bring me here, but Jessie and I, my wife Jessie, she runs the Merlin project at the lab, and she also manages the Macaulay Library, where the sounds and videos and photographs go. And it is nice to be able to spend a little bit of time down here and get to know a new place. I'm a bird person at heart, and it's just a real thrill just for the invitation to join all of you this evening, and I appreciate it. So we're gonna just jump in. Does anyone know what this bird is? Well, we'll jump into the presentation. Is everybody, that was a yellow cardinal. I'm not sure if that showed up.
Oh, cool.
Which is a bird in southern Brazil and Argentina. So this is a presentation I actually just put together over the weekend. And it really had two audiences in mind. One is all of you, and then also I was invited to give a keynote yesterday at the Fish and Wildlife Service to some of the new leaders that are coming into Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of the people involved in data management at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And tonight, what I think we'll talk about is, I'll first just give sort of an intro of some of the stats, what the data are that we collect, how we manage it. And then I'm really going to focus more on sort of the science and the research that we're doing at Cornell, and then go into conservation and management use cases. I'm not going to talk a lot about how to use eBird, but then the second half is going to be entirely open, and I'm happy to answer questions about, how you create a patch in eBird, or how do you're going to travel someplace and you want to know sort of how to figure out where to go. I'm happy to explore all of that as well. But at first, I think it's sometimes useful to sort of think about what the purpose of eBird is. And I have the great privilege about 15 years ago to join the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that is part of Cornell University. And it's a major research university. And so the driving reason behind eBird is to answer large scale questions about bird distribution. And what we want to do is to be able to understand distribution, abundance, and trends of bird populations. And our sense is the only way that we can really do this at global scales is to work with communities like like the ones here this evening, all around the world. And to do this in a centralized way, where all of the data sort of go into one place, but yet there's still a little bit of local ownership globally. And then to do this, the other thing that's really important is that we maintain a updated, most of the time, unified taxonomy. And so right now, we have just under 1 billion records in eBird. There's more than 600,000 people have submitted data. Our sister application that Jesse runs, Merlin, uses a lot of eBird data. There's more than 3 million people around the world that use that. Last year, I think there were 4.5 million people that came to the eBird website. But for us, being at Cornell, this last piece of peer-reviewed publications, publications that appear in scientific journals, is really how I'm evaluated in terms of the success of the program. That is very important. And just in the last 5 years, we've had about 250 peer-reviewed publications. If you were to look at where data are coming from, this gives a spatial distribution, with the areas that are brightest on this map are areas where we have the most data. And so it almost looks like an outline of the continents with some funky additions, right? So some of those funky additions are, you really see the line from the tip of Argentina and Chile off Tierra del Fuego that go east out to the Falkland Islands, and then the trips that go down to the Antarctic Peninsula. You can see then there's these repositioning cruises. So a lot of the cruise ships that go down to Antarctica, they come back north for our summer, and so you can see some of those. You can see sort of various crews, and one of the things that's kind of fun is if you look at some of these lines out here, you can see when nighttime is and when daytime is. And you can see that there's a road that goes across the Sahara. So when you look at this, you also start to understand that there is sampling bias that we also need to address. And so I'll get into that a little bit this evening. And so when we started out, there was a lot of thought that was really given to what data to collect. Because if you were to ask scientists, what are the data we should collect? They're going to have about 200 different variables. They want to understand the weather, they want to understand the tide, the habitat, vegetation structure, how many trees above, had a DBH greater than 1.5 feet. There's a lot of, excuse me, a lot of different types of questions that they're interested in. But as you know, our primary driver when we go out to look at birds is not necessarily all of the other pieces of information that scientists might want. It's really, I think it's really around sort of the fun of going out and looking at birds. So we try to balance those. And so what we're trying to do is really understand ecological processes. So what are the things that affect the birds that you see that are sort of real? And that might be things like, what is the habitat like? What is the climate like? And then there's things that affect your ability to detect a bird if it's there. And so, if you go out right now at night, you're not going to find the great majority of birds. They're roosting, they're sleeping, and you're not going to see them. And there's a lot of other things that really affect the second piece, which is the observation process. And so to dig into that a little bit more, the ecological process is really things like the date and the location. Within eBird on the mobile site, one of the things you can do is keep a track of where you went. And that's really important for the science team to be able to really understand more precise habitat associations. And the way that we do that is to work with NASA. We're the largest user of NASA data in the world. And a lot of that is by looking at habitat associations, elevation, climate. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at habitat. You can look at sort of fragmentation. So maybe if you have an area and half of it is forest and half of it is grassland, there can be a lot of different spatial configurations in how that's set up. And so it might be that it's just, you know, the west side is all forest, the east side is all grasslands, or it might be that there's little patches throughout. And the way that that looks is really going to have a pretty big influence on the types of birds that you find. And it's also going to change throughout the season, because if you were to, you know, take any species of bird, those habitat associations in the summer for migratory species are very different. You know, let's use swallow-tailed kite. I'm not sure some of you may have seen Margie's really amazing presentation last night on swallow-tailed kite. Those birds use very different types of habitat at different times of the year. You know, they're going in sort of in this suburban habitat where they're roosting before they leave, and breeding in sort of more remote sites. And then they're migrating and spending the winter, you know, some of them are in the Amazon. And it's even more complicated than that, because there's resident populations that are in Costa Rica. So there's a lot of complexity there that's based on geography. So all of that information we don't get from all of you. We get that because you give us, you know, a track of where you were, and we were able to link that to other data. And so, like I was mentioning, you know, we get it all the observation process. Those are the observation process are the things that affect what you're actually seeing. So if you are standing in one place, you'll probably see fewer birds than if you walk 2 miles. If you start early in the morning, you know, right around sunrise when birds are singing, and it's, you know, particularly in March and April when birds are really singing at the maximum amount, you're going to probably detect a lot more birds. If you're out longer, you're going to see more birds. And then there's just differences in terms of expertise. You know, I've been fortunate. I started birding when I was about 7 years old and traveled. I've been very fortunate to travel a lot of places. So I have a pretty good understanding of birds. I'm working on a field guide with some friends of mine. And you know, that's very different than my mom. My mom, with apologies to all the other mothers out there, she's the best mom in the world. But when it comes to doing an eBird checklist, you know, she's incredible at counting the goldfinches at the feeder. She's great at, you know, mountain chickadee, black-capped chickadee. She can separate those. She's in the sort of Denver metro area in Colorado. She can identify the lesser goldfinches. But if you know, an Audubon's warbler, a yellow-rumped warbler flies through the yard calling, she probably isn't going to detect that. And those are just natural differences that exist between observers. And so we have ways that we can sort of account for those differences. And it's not to say that there are good observers and bad observers, but to recognize that any type of sensor network, if you were to put a bunch of thermometers out across the landscape, some of them are going to be in the sun and they're going to be hot. They're going to record hotter temperatures than if they were in the shade. And so part of what we try to do in our analysis process is just to understand those. And so we gathered these pieces here, but the most important thing that we're gathering are these complete lists of all the birds that people were able to detect and identify based on, you know, the best of their ability. And complete lists are really, I would say, the single most important thing within the eBird model, because they allow us to, over time, with repeated samples, repeated visits, to infer that something isn't there, or if it is there, it's incredibly difficult to detect. So maybe that's something like, you know, whippoorwill or chuckwill's widow in the winter in Manatee County. What is the true status? Are there some birds that are here and just not vocalizing? It's really hard to say because they're very, very difficult to detect this time of year. But, you know, as we gather more data, except for some very bizarre cases like that, you know, we can have confidence that they're not there. This is very, very different from the model of something like iNaturalist, where people are reporting things that are of interest. And we work very closely with iNaturalist. We have a meeting with them, you know, once a month with Scott Laurie and his team. And it's a great project that is primarily, it thinks about building a community of naturalists. But there's some challenges when it comes to sort of the data analysis piece. And I want to show an example from eBird to just sort of show what I mean. This is a map based on eBird data of where people have photographed yellow-headed blackbird. And so if you were to just look at this based on where we have photographs, what you see is, they're basically all over the lower 48. There's some across central Mexico. There's a record down in the border of Nicaragua and Costa Rica. And there's a gap in eastern Montana and the Dakotas and maybe a little bit of Nebraska. That's very different than if we were to look at frequency. And so frequency is the percentage of checklists that people have reported to eBird where they've actually seen that bird. And so this is frequency. So when we look at this map, what we see is that, they're most common in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. So sort of these areas where they're most common are places where, ironically, they're maybe less interesting to people than when they show up down here. And so when yellow-headed blackbird shows up down here, everybody gets really excited. You go out to the celery fields, you're like, oh, there's yellow-headed blackbird this year. People go and follow, they chase them. And it's cool because they're a little bit of a novelty. And so there get to be a lot of reports. But if you look at the overall number of complete checklists, they still represent a very, very small percentage of that. And so this is a basic way of sort of getting at that difference of sort of what's interesting to people and what they're reporting. So it's really important to report these complete lists of birds. And so one of the things that Karen and Margie were asking me early on is sort of how we grow eBird globally. And one of the ways is we spend a lot of time, thinking about if there's local groups that are interested in sort of having an eBird portal and then publishing news stories on there and things like this. So this is an example of the Pacific Northwest, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Oregon Fish and Wildlife and Klamath and Pacific Birds and some other groups basically all are collaborating on this project together, and they're putting out news articles that are really related to the Pacific Northwest, and it's sort of tailored content. This has some benefit to them because it's a way of engaging sort of people that may not have run into sort of some of these local groups that are trying to attract new members. And it's useful for us because now we're able to connect people, with people that actually live in a region and have some expertise where they can go out and join them on field trips and all of the things that I think you all are already privileged to do with the three Audubon groups that are represented here tonight. And some of this really gets into, even managing the project. So, we have if you think back to that first map of that I showed you about where there was a lot of participation, if you look at India really lights up. And one of the reasons that India lights up in this map so much is because we have a group Bird Count India that's managing the project there. There's over 200 different regional editors that are thinking about how to adapt eBird so that it meets the needs of that community. And there's a lot of different examples sort of around the world now of those initiatives. These are a few of them. The other thing that we've been doing the last sort of 5 years or so is extending different kinds of protocols into eBird. So researchers and groups can run different projects within eBird. And so the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas was the first example, but Virginia, North Carolina, Maine, New York are running their atlases through eBird, where basically you say, okay, I'm going to make sure that I stay within the boundaries of this block. I'm going to look for breeding codes, and there's some additional things that people can do. I think these are the pieces that you might be most used to. There's a lot of tools within eBird that allow you to sort of keep track of the birds that you're seeing, look at it over time, look at your life list. There's another page on Explore that really allows you to sort of dive into a lot of detail about species. You can explore individual locations, that can be at the level of an island or a country, or you can dive into individual national wildlife refuges or hotspots. You can look at a hotspot like Finley National Wildlife Refuge and just look at the photos that have been taken there. You can do the same with sounds. There's profile pages that allow you to sort of see how many birds you've seen in different counties and different countries and things like that. Those are all, ways of engaging, people like me. I basically build the tool for me, to be perfectly honest. Like, what are the things that make my birding a little bit more fun and help me answer questions? But that isn't really the fundamental goal. We invest in all of those pieces for research. And, when we're thinking about researchers, there's a lot of different types of research that we think about. So there can be just sort of basic research that are looking at sort of fundamental questions in statistics and computer science and ecology. Could be applied researchers that are trying to understand conservation of tricolored blackbird, and I'll give an example of that. Or it could be that you're a land manager or a policymaker that's trying to understand where you should purchase habitat to protect a given species. Or you could be a land trust that's trying to, that's decided that you have an important role to play in the conservation of grassland species. Where are some places where you could invest, and that investment would be particularly strong based on the data that we have? Or the final example that we do a lot now are sort of these collaborative projects where the science team, the eBird science team, works with groups like Fish and Wildlife Service or the Nature Conservancy on very specific research questions. And some of these are pretty big because there's so much difference in terms of how data are collected. And so some of the examples of kind of basic research, I think are intuitive almost. One of the major questions is just where and when do you find birds in different places? What this particular research question was looking at wasn't sort of where and when, but it had to do with the timing of the speed of migration and how that changed from spring to fall. So what we're looking at is each of these dots represents the center of distribution of an individual species. And what happens here is if you were to look at one of these individual dots, the one that sort of goes off the east coast of Canada in the winter and then up into northern Canada, that's actually purple sandpiper. So if you were to take all of the records of purple sandpiper and say, where is the center of distribution of that? That's the dot that right now is, off sort of south of Newfoundland in the eastern part of Canada. And this is a way of looking at sort of how the speed happens. And so there's a lot of interesting things about, the speed. Birds are moving faster in spring than they are in fall. Lots of sort of really cool, interesting questions. I'm not going to go into that level of detail of all of these, but there's been research that's really looked at sort of ecology and how the overlap of distribution can affect mimicry of birds. And so a really good example of that is Downey and hairy woodpecker. They overlap extensively. They're actually not the most closely related species to each other. There's a hypothesis that basically Downey woodpeckers are starting to look like hairy woodpecker, which is a bigger, more aggressive bird. We just happen to be in one of the few places in the lower 48 where one of those species is actually really rare. And interestingly, then Downey woodpecker seems like in areas where hairy isn't there, they're actually a bit less common too. Lots of cool things to really dive into there that I won't get too much into. I think everybody probably knows that there's a lot of work being done on how birds are responding to changes in climate off of eBird data. There's a lot of work being done in understanding sort of applied conservation and how to optimize conservation. particularly for complicated things like birds where they're, breeding in one area, wintering in another. In winter, they may actually have sort of 2 or 3 different areas that they're wintering in. So there's a lot of very complicated sort of trade-off questions to get at. Or it could be things having to do with sort of how you put a price or an importance on sort of different protected areas. And so we can look at this in terms of how far people are willing to travel in order to look at birds and things like that. So to do those types of things, if you wanted to this evening, you could go in and have a request to download the eBird dataset, and you could download the 47.8 gigabytes of eBird data, open it up in R. Hopefully you have a very robust computer. A supercomputer would be good. Or you could get a subset of data and really start exploring your own sort of questions. And that's a main way that people go about doing that. But like I mentioned, these are pretty challenging and sophisticated analyses to do. So there's also a lot of effort that our science team does in publishing peer-reviewed publications on just how to analyze the data. What are the best practices for analyzing large data sets that have had a variety of types of computers or a variety of types of experience, where they're going out and they're specifically often picking locations where they think they're going to find birds. Very few of us go out and say, I'm going to go to areas where I don't think I'm going to find any birds today. And I'm going to go cover those because those are undersampled in eBird. I know that I should be doing that. I do it occasionally. But frankly, it's not quite as fun as maybe going to Emerson Point in the morning and, going around and looking for migrants and seeing shorebirds and stuff, where bird watchers were not sort of cornfield monitors. So that means that a scientist, though, really needs to take that into account and balance how they do it. So there's a huge amount of information on sort of how to account for those types of differences. And then there's also an understanding on our team that a lot of us may not have the technical sophistication to be able to do this. It requires some pretty intensive computer processes. And that's where we're really focused on this eBird status and trends, which is both the name of the team of people that are working on this and also a suite of data products. And if I were at a very high level to say sort of what we're trying to do here, it's that we're trying to control for all of the observation process that determines which of the species that are present at a location have been detected, identified, and reported. And that's a fairly sophisticated and difficult question that is actually advancing the fields of statistics, the field of computer science, and also sort of the interface of those two. And so you could think of statistics as really being the approach is to try to understand causation and why something is happening. And you could think of what computer science is really good at is putting a whole bunch of variables together and being able to predict what's going to happen, but you may not be able to say why. And so a lot of the people that are major investors in the stock market, they don't really care why something is happening. They just want to make a bunch of money. So if they can have some very intensive models, black box models that are really, really good at predicting things, they may not need to understand why. The Biden administration, they're coming in, they want to actually affect change. They tend to gravitate more towards statistical models to be able to understand sort of what are the drivers that if we can change this, this inflection point, there's going to be a big change that's going to improve the economy or something like that. So what we're trying to do is sort of both. And so we're combining a lot of these different modeling approaches together, and it's a pretty exciting area of research. I'm not going to talk about this other than to say there's a pretty advanced modeling framework that we're doing, and what you could think of it as is we're doing something called niche modeling, sort of, where we're trying to understand how bird distribution, what are the drivers of bird distribution within different geographic areas. So we'll do a model that's, in South Florida. We'll do another model that's in maybe Central Florida. We'll do another model in North Florida, another model in Georgia. And we'll do that for the first week of January. And then we'll mix that all up and we'll do the same thing again, this time maybe centered on Western Manatee County. And then we'll do it again centered on, right at the border of Sarasota and Manatee County. And then we'll do another one that's centered just a bit east of there, all still for that first week of January. And then combine those together. Then we'll do it for the second week of January. So you can see in here that we're talking about, terabytes and thousands of hours of processing in order to do these models. But what this allows us to do is first, we've already covered how we've moved from presence to frequency, but now what we can do is we can go much further and start to look at relative abundance, because we're really trying to understand the underlying dynamics to be able to give us a map of where the real distribution is. And this is pretty damn good. Like this is pretty awesome. Like when this came out, you really start seeing these core areas of where yellow-headed blackbird is. And what you can see is, red is the breeding season. The areas that are deepest red are where the bird is most abundant. The blues are areas where the bird is found in winter. Blue is most abundant, the deep blues. And then yellow, brightest yellow is sort of most abundant, and that's in migration. And then you can see in the Central Valley of California, those are some of the few areas where yellow-headed blackbird is actually sort of a resident species. And we can use the data itself to then define what the migration windows actually are. And so what's interesting here is, you can see with something like yellow-headed blackbird, they're already migrating by early March, moving north out of Mexico. And the breeding season is very, very short. They're nesting in deep cattail marshes. They're nesting there very briefly, and then they start dispersing. And in a lot of cases, migration is much more fascinating and much more interesting. Margie talked about this last night in terms of swallow-tailed kite. The places where birds are actually breeding, where their nest is, they'll nest there and then they'll often leave that right after the young fledge. And the characteristics of what the birds are feeding on to feed a bird in a nest could be very, very different from once the young fledge and can't fly very well. Then they may go to a different habitat with, and the insects, if they're feeding on insects, and most young birds are feeding on insects, those change cyclically, so they could be moving to different areas. So that's why this breeding season, is really short here. And defining that, you could ask someone like me, an expert, and I'm going to give you sort of a reasonable idea of when I think it is. But now, because of hundreds of thousands of bird watchers around the world and all of the data that you're providing, we're able to do this in a way that's really much, much more sophisticated. And we can also look at that for every week of the year. So this is a case where look how fast that spring migration was for Canada warbler. I mean, so here it is, January, February, March, and once April hits, boom, April, May, they go to the breeding grounds really, really quickly. This is a bird that actually moves pretty fast in the fall as well. And this is a bird that winters almost entirely in the Andes. And you can really start understanding those patterns. Again, we can do something similar to what we did with yellow-headed blackbird, where we can then create these abundance maps just by sort of overlaying those data on top of themselves. And so you can see, right here, Baltimore Oriole, yeah, they are present in this part of Florida, but in very, very, very small numbers. You be a little bit lucky to run into one, compared to if you were to go to Nicaragua or Costa Rica or Panama, where they're much, much more common. So what this opens up then, I think, is some of the things that get to be really, really quite exciting. So I'm gonna point to a specific case here with bald eagles. And the project was actually done on both bald eagles and golden eagles. And this was a collaboration between the science team at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and several people from the National Raptor Program at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Migratory Bird Program. That's Brian Millsap, Mark Otto, and Emily Bieri. And in this example, what we did, and we is exclusive of me, I had very little, nothing to do with this, but the really brilliant science team is the quantitative scientists at the lab in Fish and Wildlife used this map, the sort of top left map. This is very similar to the examples that I just showed for orioles and Canada warbler and yellow-headed blackbird, to be able to look at relative abundance of bald eagle at different times of the year. And then we could use these to delineate zones of low collision risk. So one of the things that Fish and Wildlife is very interested in is, you know, we want to protect eagles. We don't want them running into wind turbines. But on the other hand, we know that wind turbines have some benefit in terms of climate, in terms of energy generation. So how can you balance sort of bird collisions with wind turbines, just specifically here thinking about eagles? And there's a process of surveys that are needed in order for Fish and Wildlife to issue a permit for wind turbines to be sited. And the idea here was to be able to say, okay, what are the areas where there's not low exposure and where there is low exposure for bald eagles? So something like, you can see basically most of Florida, there's eagles in most of Florida and they're not low exposure areas. As opposed to, you know, there's a few places, you know, in the western parts of sort of around Big Bend where there aren't many bald eagles. This is a way that allows Fish and Wildlife to really understand distribution and then enact policy because of this. So this is, for those interested, this is in the Journal of Applied Ecology, and was really, you know, focused on sort of how you take citizen science data and inform policy to reduce collision areas for wind energy. The overall strategy here is sort of, I think, good to go back to. One is, you know, having this carefully designed project and then really partnering with policymakers to understand very specifically exactly what their needs are. And then to use this and then start validating the data and say, okay, you know, there's also a lot of information from eagle nest surveys, there's wintering bald eagle surveys. And what we found is that eBird data are very good, not just to say where birds are, but they're also very good to say where birds are not. And again, it gets back to that complete checklist. This is a pretty big difference between most other surveys. You know, for bald eagle surveys, people tend to go to where they think they're going to find eagles that are monitoring them there. So it's harder to use those type of data for something like, you know, wind energy development. Another example that I think is a kind of neat one is with tricolored blackbird. And in this example, this is the first to use eBird data to model population dynamics. And the key here is that eBird data doesn't have to be used in isolation. There's often other data sets that are very useful to inform conservation strategies and federal listing. And so to start with, it's probably worth remembering or learning that about 95% of all the tricolored blackbirds breed in the US in the state of California. And since the, you know, mid 1950s, 60s, there's been this really substantial decline in tricolored blackbird populations. And so they've been this species of conservation concerns, but they're really complicated to figure out because in some years they'll nest in one place, then they'll move to another colony, they'll nest there, then they might go back. They go and feed in different types of habitat. It's basically a really, really hard bird to monitor because of both the day-to-day movements and the year-to-year movements. And so there were several previous efforts to list the species as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And the reason that never went through is because there wasn't a reliable population model. And so the idea was, and those were based on, you know, survival analysis and banding and nest monitoring. And what happened is you couldn't develop a population model because birds were leaving that area. And so it looked like there was just massive mortality when what it was is the birds were leaving. So by bringing in eBird data, we could develop something that was called an integrated population model, where you combine eBird observations with structured surveys, with banding data and nesting data. And that allows us to estimate population trends. This is a paper that's published in Biological Conservation, if any of you are interested. And so through this integrated population modeling, we could very quickly see that tricolored blackbird abundance had declined 34% just in the last 10 years. And so looking at banding data, looking at nesting productivity data and eBird observations, you're able to see that the low reproductive rates were likely behind the population declines. One of the really hard things is, it's hard enough just to understand that there are declines that are happening, but understanding the cause of that and what is the season that's causing it is pretty complicated. And that's where some of these we call them IPMs, these integrated population models, are really, really useful. And so the results of this was that in 2018, tricolored blackbird was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act after 14 years of petitioning. Switching gears entirely, hopefully at this point, all of you are even more excited to use eBird than you have been and engaged. And I think the best place to really start is something called the eBird Essentials course. So if you just Google eBird Essentials, this is a free class that's in the Bird Academy that sort of walks through sort of how to use eBird, how to explore eBird and things like that. So I'll probably wind to a little bit of a close now, but we've been incredibly fortunate to receive 11 different National Science Foundation grants, great support from the Leon Levy Foundation, the Wolf Creek Foundation, Seaver Institute. I already mentioned sort of the collaborations that we've had with NASA for many, many years, US Fish and Wildlife Service. But I think it's really important to remember that all of this begins with you. None of this would be possible if there weren't sort of this passionate group of bird watchers around the world that are willing to spend a little bit of extra time and keep track of the birds that they're seeing. And we continue to do what we can to make the website fun and to put some tools in there that are kind of fun to use. But ultimately, we're in this for the science and the conservation piece, and that's all because of you. So I just really appreciate all of you joining me this evening and being able to explore this. I'll stop my ramblings now, and we can sort of turn things over to questions. And I can bring up the website, or I have lots of other slides and things that I can bring in. But thank you so much. This has been really a treat for me.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. Are you coming back, Margie? We do have several questions. I'll start from the top. There she is. Do you want to do the Q&A, Margie?
I can't see myself here. Can you see me? I don't know where I.
Click the Zoom icon if you have a Zoom icon on your.
Yeah, I've got it here now, but I can't seem to see anybody else then.
I can jump into Bob's question if you want.
Yeah.
I was letting people know I spend about 7 or 8 hours a day on Zoom, so I feel like I'm at home in so many ways right now. But Bob, this is a really good question, and it's very timely as well. I actually have a meeting next week with Kathy Dunning at Christmas Bird Count and at Audubon to really start exploring sort of what are the things that we need to do to try to integrate these more. And so we have some ideas, right now of some things that we're thinking about. So some of that is, people could go out, they can have their checklist, and really what we need is a way then to allow them to sort of go to some centralized account where they can be shared and looked at. And then there's some additional work that may need to be done there. So you may need to be able to say, okay, let's look at all the laughing gulls and all the ring-billed gulls, and we know that they're flying over. And so how are we going to deal with those? And that's the sort of same machinations, if you will, that already happen as part of this. I used to be I forget the word for it, but the Bill Prantey, let's say, if you will, the Bill Prantey of Colorado for Christmas bird count. So I have a little bit of understanding about some of the challenges there. And I think what's really exciting is National Audubon and the lab, starting back in July, have started, went through a process to sort of jointly identify priorities to really figure out, how can the lab and Audubon work together to bring the 3 billion birds that have been lost in the last 30 years back. And there's several different initiatives that we identified. And among the things that we've been talking about is thinking about better ways to integrate these data sets together. So I'm also, this may not come across this evening very well, but I do tend to think of myself as a pretty good listener. It's hard in this format. So ideas that all of you have and how we could do that would also be very, very appreciated.
Great. So I hope you don't mind. Maybe I've got 2 questions and then we'll go to more Q&A. But when you mention tracks on eBird, or when you showed them, I felt sort of sheepish and guilty. Like when you are able to get those tracks of, I guess, presumably birders walking, isn't that Merlin? Is that eBird or is that Merlin?
Yeah, so that's eBird. And what I can do is we'll play around in my account. Can you still see this?
Yes.
My page?
Still
Okay.
on.
So we're in my stuff here. You can see me with my scrub jay. And let's go. We'll do what I did. So you can see I cut out of work 5 minutes early today. And I can zoom this in. So this is sort of the route. This is exactly the route where I walked around this place where we're staying. And for those of you that are, Manatee County listeners, we zoom in along this little creek here. There was a solitary sandpiper, which is a county bird for me. So I was very excited. But these are sort of the tracks that you have. So if you use the mobile app, either in Android or iOS, those will come over, when you're using it. And I can, this is suboptimal. That's not going to work. But basically, on the screen, when you click Start Checklist, there's an option to have the track on there, and unless you turn that off, it's gonna be on. And then when you go into the website, you'll be able to see it. But those are really, really helpful. And some of you may have noticed, like when I go to a really big place like Duet, I do sort of these 1 kilometer counts, and you'll see that I have like 10 different lists or 15 different lists for these little sections I walk. That's all to allow the science team, they sort of pick that out, and then they pull the actual track segment and use that when they're doing the analysis. So that's why I tend to sort of break things up. This is what you're seeing on the page over here that I'm sharing is about the biggest track that you'll see, about one of the biggest ones you'll see. I tend not to do ones much longer than that.
So in other words, we need to do our lists on our phones to be able to, and I, that shows that I don't do that. I'm sort of attached to those handwritten lists and come home and list them out, but that's very helpful.
There's some advantages to that. The other thing that I like is, it lets me know right at the time if something's unusual.
Yeah.
So I know, I should get a photo of it. And
if you don't mind, another question. And related to swallowtail kites, I live in an area where I'm trespassing constantly to do my swallowtail kite research in Lower Manatee County on golf courses. So I don't list every day. And the question I have is, some of those lists I still haven't done from summer. I listed the crucial ones, like when they left and disappeared from anywhere around here. But is there, even a late list is better than no listing, right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, one of the things that's, you know, everything's hard in life, but it's much harder to go back and get information from back in time. You know, we continue to be growing at about 20 to 30% per year. So we're getting more and more people engaged, but those data that are older data are, they end up being very, very valuable. And one of the challenges is that, you know, sometimes as you go back in time, you know, I don't have like complete lists for all, you know, I have sort of the highlights.
Yeah. And
that's okay. That's just sort of the reality. What you never want to do is unless your memory is significantly better than mine, we don't want you to sort of go back and try to recall sort of all the birds that you saw on an individual walk from 15 years ago. Unless your memory is like sort of amazing. You can use X's to indicate that something was present, but it's so hard, at least for me, it's really hard to remember, you know, exactly what I saw this day versus, you know, the next day.
Thank you. So some other questions. Renata Beers asks, if a group of 6 birders go birding, should each of them submit identical lists?
Yeah, that's a great question. On this page and in the app, there's this button here that's share. Can everybody see sort of it's highlighting in here? If I click share, what this does is I can share this list with Jessie, my wonderful wife. And I would click this button. She sets me up as a friend. So she was not with me. She was working like a good person. I was out having fun. So I'm not actually going to share it. But that's really the best way to have a group go out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a few days. So this is from this morning when Jessie and I went out together. Let's suppose that I missed the frigate birds, the spoonbills, one of those cool birds that's a Florida bird we don't see in New York. If I missed the spoonbill, there's an option where I can remove this from my list. And then what happens is I'll see down here, there's additional birds that are seen by Jessie. And now what I can do is I can go back and add this. One thing you might see is this review button. I'm a sort of run eBird, so I can review any of the data in eBird. So this is something that that I see that very few other people on this call will see. This is something that just sort of the data quality folks see.
You know, what's amazing is the fabulously high number of questions you're getting, which shows how important it is what you're telling us. It's incredible. I've never seen so many questions. How has COVID affected the number of eBird observers and observations?
So that is a spectacular question because, and I'm gonna try to multitask. The reason it's so good is literally today, the team had a paper that was published that looked at this. So I'm going to see if I can.
I wonder if the number's really risen because people don't have anything else to do.
Yeah, Jessie's gonna send it to me. But let's answer, Jessie's gonna send that to me. I'm going to click on it. But basically, it's complicated. We've seen a big increase in the number of Merlin users, and we've seen differences in sort of where people are birding, which I think sort of makes sense. You know, there's less traveling, and it also varies by country. So this particular analysis of the paper that is just coming out in biological conservation really is looking at sort of that very question. And so a day or two from now, if you were to Google this, you'd be able to pick it up. And I don't think it's out on our social media things, but the lab will have links to this, and we'll have a story up on it coming up. So I don't want to steal all their thunder, but a lot of it really has to do with the patterns do vary regionally. And so in places like Spain, where there was a really, really strong lockdown, I mean, basically leaving the house wasn't, you had to be in your house, particularly at the beginning. The number of checklists went up, but it was very much in, from towns. And that's, another one of these sort of complexities that when you're analyzing data that that you need to jump into. So that's a super question. And there's, let's see if I have. Yeah, well, these are not the most intuitive. You can dive into that if you want to. We could look at that and see if it it makes sense. I'm not going to explain that.
All right. Are you ready for the next question?
I am.
All right. Maureen Dwyer, a male painted bunting was spotted in Maryland in January. Is that a result of climate change? Would you anticipate such a sighting will become more common? Wow, that's a good question. I'm seeing all kinds of things even here.
It's a super question, and I think it's one of the things that scientists often, we turn on our science sort of mumbling, and we do a lot of hand waving, and it is really hard to attribute sort of any individual thing that we see to sort of any one cause. But I think the second part of that is, yeah, quite possibly it seems like it might be more likely that in general there is a pattern of birds to be showing up further north than they have. And I think, the other thing that we're seeing more and more of is birds that are showing up out of range that just sort of defy any previous reality. And so I think many of you probably remember a few years ago the razorbill eruption that took place, with them showing up on the Gulf Coast of Florida. I mean, Jesse and I saw them in Apalachicola. I mean, that's insane. They shouldn't be anywhere near here. And that was something that we did quite a bit of work to sort of understand the underlying dynamics there, and all of these things are interlinked. And there it really looked like it had to do with sea currents and exactly where warm water was that particular year, all of which is likely driven by climate change. And so it's hard to answer sort of any individual event without sort of going into it. But I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of conflicting, because at one level, as a bird watcher, there is something that is pretty special about going out and seeing something sort of unexpected and novel and unprecedented. But there is also sort of this sort of warning sign that, the magnitude of the number of things that are sort of unusual and atypical is really worth understanding, to understand what are those things telling us. And so much of our knowledge of how humans are affected by different things in the environment have really come from birds. And I think all of you know this all too well, Rachel Carson and American robins and Silent Spring, peregrine falcons and DDT. There's a history of which Audubon has absolutely been a core part of using birds to understand that our relationship with the natural world is out of kilter. And we very much view birds as a way of highlighting this. And so sort of when painted buntings show up out of range, those are exactly the type of questions that we're thinking about as well. What does that tell us? It's a really, really great question.
Jean, did you want to make a comment about this or go to this question? I see there's a comment here, but so moving, go ahead.
No, just keep going down the, it would be wonderful to get through all of these questions. So that would be, just keep going.
Jessica Parrish has 2 questions. What are the additional tools or updates you want to incorporate into eBird?
Yeah, so CBC, I think we talked about that. That's a goal for us. You know, really thinking about ways. There's another survey called the Breeding Bird Survey. You know, thinking about ways to sort of pull those data together. Close to home for Audubon and the important bird area project. You know, we've identified important bird areas as we are bringing in those layers, developing specific monitoring frameworks that could answer sort of more specific questions having to do with IBAs and key biodiversity areas. I think is really important, both for our, you know, the collaborations we have with Audubon and also with BirdLife International. In terms of sort of fun eBird stuff, one of the things that I'm most excited about, we don't yet have a name for, but it's really around reporting. And we understand that by asking people to sort of break lists up into specific lists, when you go on a trip, let's all imagine the day, hopefully not too long from now, when we can once again go on a trip to some new place. It's fun to be able to go and explore the birds that you're seeing. So if any of you have been on a tour, usually at the end of the tour, you get a trip report, talks about, you know, how many days you saw a magnificent frigate bird. I've got a frigate bird kick right now because they're awesome. How many days you saw frigate birds, what's the highest count of frigate birds, or maybe it's because they're sort of like swallow-tailed kites and Margie's got my mind on, you know, birds with awesome tails. But whatever the case may be, like those trip reports are really fun things, and we don't really have that functionality in eBird. And so what we're trying to do is not just think about how to replicate sort of what's available today when you go on a tour, but to really think creatively about what the future of trip reports could be like and how we share that information out. So what I'm envisioning is more of a collaborative trip report where a group, suppose that, you know, you have a trip out to the celery fields. You know, there's maybe a leader that goes in, they enter their list into eBird, and that's shared out. Then everybody can go in, they can sort of add the species that they saw, delete the ones they missed, upload their own photos to that checklist, and you sort of have the ability then for lots of people to sort of take and develop sort of a communal list, and then adding some sort of supplemental information in there, choosing who they share that with. And there's other things that could be cool in how we do that, thinking about, you know, if we could do that in such a way that, you know, you're going on a trip to Colombia, one of the most amazing countries in the world. Let's say you're going to go to the Montezuma Rainforest Lodge, my all-time favorite place in the world, next to Manatee County. And you want, you know, to be able to share with your family and friends and these 3 Audubon groups, what you're seeing. What we are thinking about is basically setting up a framework where you could say, okay, this trip is to Colombia, it's over these dates, and as I add my birds to it, that trip is going to basically build out, and it's going to be sort of a private link that you can sort of choose to share with a certain subset of people. Now, I want to be very clear, this is sort of our long-range plan for where we're thinking some of those trip reports could go, but that's sort of where we're thinking of a lot of excitement around building that out. So I hate to say, you know, I could spend all night talking about sort of cool ideas, but I wish we were doing this in person because I'd love to hear sort of what your ideas are for some of the things we could do.
I think I'm going to come back to Jessica's second question a little bit later if we have time. Alice Deutsch asks, some observations on eBird are designated confirmed. What determines that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to show sort of how to get it more detailed than my superficial question. So one of the things in eBird is at the top of the, I'm going to show again. So if you're looking at my screen, there's, and you see my mouse here, see where it says help. If you click on help, there's all these different things having to do with different types of questions. And so there's questions about how your data are used, the glossary, things like this, but you can also, type in different questions here. So data quality, and there's something on here for the eBird review process. And this goes into a lot of information that I promise you, I will not go into all of this. And then it also includes a download that is really the review guidelines that all of the volunteer editors. So Brian Aaron is I think spearheading a lot of the review efforts right now. One of the things I think we want to do is really expand the group of people that are interested in helping with review, because we approached this early on with an approach of thinking about, really focused on sort of the data quality piece and making sure that the accuracy is really high. There's now, I think, a really great opportunity for us not just to ensure that, but also create more of a learning environment where some of the people that are involved in the review could be helping with questions about, just should I answer yes to the question, am I reporting all species, or I have some questions about that, sort of helping with that and doing this at sort of a community level and sort of building trust. And so the idea is to really expand that team out. If you're interested in sort of helping with that process, definitely let me know. My email is chris.wood@cornell.edu. I'm not going to be the person to get in touch with you. Jenna Curtis and Marshall Iliff, they really are sort of working with the data quality process, but this is something that I think we have a lot of energy around, and because I'm sort of new to the area, I have a lot of energy around this particular area right now and thinking about that. But when it says confirm, to get to your question, what that means is, in this case, Brian has looked at that and said, okay, I think there's enough information in the notes, or the bird is unusual enough that I'm going to confirm it. And the process, I'm going to show this just to help explain sort of how this works. There's some pages that are sort of this quick review. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to show you Australia because that may not be quite as intuitive. And I don't have I have some New York options here. So I'm going to pick a New York option just to show. So what a reviewer sees is basically this bird, white-crowned sparrow, showed up at this place in Freeville. They have some good notes. They talk about there weren't yellow lures to help set it apart from white-throated sparrow. No white bib. Okay, I would have said throat instead of bib, but that's just a terminology thing, so it looks good. So I'm going to accept this record and say, documentation field notes. There's a lot of different ways that this sorts. So it's not, sometimes people can get frustrated because they reported something first, but the reviewer may not have reviewed, they may review a record that came in later. That just has to do with sort of how these records end up in the review queue. And there's lots of ways. So here I'm looking at all nearly 500,000 records from around the world. Some New Zealand ones, some Australia ones. This looks like a Spain record for Eurasian nightjar. Here's a northern goshawk that comes with a photo. Sometimes what happens is if there's a photo, it's easier to sort of click on, oh geez.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's a bit too interpretive for me. I'm not going to address that. I was thinking there would be a photo that was maybe a little bit easier to do, but you can also search by, I should not be doing this for all of the records around the world. My database team is going to send me a nasty note about why I'm doing this. But here's an example where, okay, these are birds. Here's another goshawk. That does not look like a goshawk. You can see why some of these are still in review. Like it's not super intuitive. This is a cool one. So here's somebody who's put in a high count for geese, and they've actually put numbers in for sort of how they've estimated the numbers of geese. This is pretty cool. In this case, what I would do is I'd go in and say accept, reason, documentation, field notes, or in this case, photo, and then change this. You can see sort of all the different ways that you can sort this and why some records may be in review. If you really want to dive into that, definitely go to the Help Center, type in data quality, and you can there's a lot of information about that process in there.
Students at Cornell. His wife's students.
So boy, and how to improve the process. There's so many different ways of going about this. But one thing to look at is in here, this section on eBird next steps. There's a lot of information on sort of what are the next things you can do. So when you're getting started, you know, this section that we've worked very creative, we've creatively called Getting Started, is really the best place to start with. But then there's a lot of information here on sort of using eBird, documenting your records a bit more. There's a lot of information here on just sort of how to count birds and approaches for counting birds. And we get into sort of blocking groups of birds out, how you deal with mixed species flocks. So what I would say is, you know, to improve the data for science uses, I would, you know, use eBird all the time or as often as you can. Tend to do relatively short lists. So, you know, one thing to think about is instead of doing a count for all of a place like Duet, you know, if you get out of the car in one place and do some birding there, I would do a checklist there. And then when you get back in the car and drive somewhere else, I would do a different checklist at that place, because it allows us to, and I think one of the things is as you get used to that process gets to be pretty fun, because you start to notice these differences. And I would argue that one of the reasons that I tend to see a lot of birds is I do break things up, and I really try, when I stop and look someplace, to look through and count all the birds, and, you know, look in different areas. And I spend a lot of time scanning the sky. And so just sort of thinking about that is really fun. And I mean, for me, it's just been so fascinating to that some of the assumptions I had. So I'm in a new place. I'm at Terracea, the area that you were seeing. Each evening, I sort of do this walk around here. And what's so amazing is every night, the birds are different. Some nights there's big flocks of robins that are going over. Yesterday morning, I had my biggest count of yellow-rumped warblers at Emerson Point, which is, you know, only like 48 birds or something like that. But 25 of them early in the morning got up, flew south over the Manatee River. I haven't seen them doing that. It's not like a regular thing where I'm seeing them. So there's just all these questions that for me, like, yeah, it's really fun when you see sort of a rare bird, like, you know, you're at the celery fields, which is just insane in terms of rarity potential, and going and seeing like a dickcissel, and these surprises are super, super fun. But for me, it's just as fun to sort of unpack the movements of these birds, and like understanding, like, what is it that some nights there's big numbers of gulls that come and roost in the bay, but other nights there aren't. To what extent is that tide driven? Is it wind driven? And there's all these like fascinating questions that you can just sort of pick your place that's exciting to you, and just sort of try to figure this out. I mean, this is what Margie, I think, last night was talking about with swallow-tailed kite. You know, that can be on an individual species, just really trying to understand one bird and what's happening. And as you start to sort of dive into those birds, you know, I still tend to count the other birds too, but there's just unlimited questions that this world of birds sort of opens up. And so be open to those questions. There's so many things that we do not know about birds that just makes it, for me, incredibly fascinating.
Wow, this is amazing. Is it right if we keep going with questions?
I love this. This is fun. I used to be able to, I started 15 years ago, and Brian Sullivan and I, we would get to spend a lot of time sort of doing these kind of events. And now, because I speak Spanish, I tend to do these in Latin America in Spanish. This is sort of the first English presentation I've given, to a non sort of very scientific or administrator audience in for probably 4 or 5 years. So this is really fun for me, just to hear some of the questions.
It's great, and most people are still on. So, that there's a lot of interest in your answers, or the questions and your answers. Michael Sutton asked, do other countries have a similar citizen science platform as eBird?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of what we're trying to do is to develop these collaborations to use a common platform. So an example of that is in Australia. There was a different, actually what I'm going to do is just go into, and there's a specific portal for eBird in Australia. So if you look at the news items here, some of them are similar to the ones that we've done, but others are written sort of by the team that's in Australia. And so you'll see that sort of the stats here, when I go onto eBird Australia, these are my stats specifically for Australia. I've seen 234 birds in Australia. I haven't uploaded any of my audio files. Jessie is going to not be happy about that, since she runs the Macaulay Library. But another example of this is if I go in here and look at India, Bird Count India they do a lot of work just to sort of talk about what's going on in the community. So you'll see that every month they have sort of this update on what's going on, and anyone can sort of look and see sort of what they're doing in various months. This is a really cool example of sort of, there's a lot of groups that are using it just much beyond sort of what the lab does. So there's a team of scientists in India that are basically put together this State of India birds status assessment, looking at what's happening with birds. And this is again, it's another broad collaboration. You can go in and click on this and really, dive into exactly what's happening with birds in India. So it's a pretty big global initiative right now. Europe does have some specific individual portals, Observato, and the British Trust for Ornithology, BTO, has something called Bird Track that's similar, that we collaborate and share data. So there's a few other platforms too.
Diana Owens asks or says, I've observed house finch eye disease recently. If I put that in the notes section under species, can researchers find it by a keyword search, or would they have to look at every individual note?
That's a great question. So there's two ways that I think we're approaching this. One, and I'm not going to be able to, I don't think I have it in here. One is researchers can download the data, and then they're basically going through, and they can there's several different ways that they can train text algorithms to search for, house finch eye disease. The other approach that we're really thinking about now, and I'll give a different example, is we were approached by an electricity group in sort of western part of the U.S., California and Utah, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, I guess. And they were really interested in understanding where birds were sitting on utility poles, to understand sort of where there's a higher probability of electrocution. Because if a bird goes, basically what happens is if the bird's wings, if there's two lines that are going and the wings connect on either side, basically that the electricity flows through the bird and it kills the bird. It also can cause, major problems for the electricity company. So they were interested in really understanding. So there's a bunch of questions like that around individual birds. And if you're able to get a photograph of the bird, then there's also ways that we can train machine learning models to either look at utility polls, send those utility polls to PG&E so that they can prioritize, and the polls are often marked with a unique marker up at the top. And so they can prioritize sort of the polls to fit. You may have seen there's ways that electricity companies can sort of put a pole sort of on top of the pole with perches for raptors, or there's other ways they can retrofit those to reduce the collision potential. The other thing that we could do and are doing is looking at the notes for eye disease within, and then when there's photos, we're training those. And we've done that with eye disease. We've also done it with things like nests, where people have said that there's a nest of a bird or something like that. And so there's a whole bunch of things related to machine learning and using the text comments. Diana, that's an awesome question.
So Kylie Wilson, who manages our local protected shorebirds and seabirds, their nests and everything, what's your advice for including sensitive species on eBird? Is it something we should avoid, particularly adding information about nesting or presence of chicks?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And what I want to do, this is sort of like a broken record, but what I also want to do is, I'm not always going to be here, so I'm also trying to just sort of point out how I would get to some of the information. So I'd go into the help center and I'd type in sensitive species. And there's a lot of information on here and why certain things might not be on sensitive species. But I'll give a sort of high-level overview for how we think about sensitive species. And then I'll get into the specific question. So when we're thinking about sensitive species, and the birds that we choose to sort of hide from everybody, those are things where there's a targeted effort by people to go and sort of harm birds in some ways. And so that would be things like a case in Florida is painted bunting, where there's predominantly Cuban population is interested, it likes to have painted buntings as pets. And so there's a specific effort where people would go out and they would try to target that species. There's other instances like that. There also can be cases where birds might be nesting, but that information is a little less available in eBird. Like, you need to really dive into quite a bit of details to understand, like, if there's a nest in a place. And to me, the way that I think about it, and there's a lot of perspectives on this, is that a lot of that is an education campaign, because there's a lot of ways that people understand and have access to figuring out where shorebirds are nesting. In a lot of cases, they are protected areas, and there's even signs up that basically say there's least terns and piping plovers here. So hiding that, sometimes can also have a counterbalancing effect, where people that are interested in those may not be aware of those sites and may not be engaged in sort of the ability to sort of work with communities to try to think about, okay, when you're photographing birds, there really are some best practices of what you should be thinking about to protect birds. And that's where I think, groups like Audubon play such an important role in sort of working with photographers and thinking, and all these things, it would be great if these things didn't take time, but the reality is that I think that the conversations are actually the difficult part. That's where the work is, and talking to photographers and explaining why we should be careful about things like that, I think is often a better long-term approach than necessarily hiding things. That said, if there may be specific cases where, at the scale that eBird's thinking about, we don't offer, you may want to hide something. In that case, what you do when you're looking at an individual checklist, so we'll go back to my latest checklist. Within this checklist tools, can everybody see this sort of big blue button up at the top right? If I click on this, there's something here that says hide from eBird output. If I click this, basically what this does is it hides the whole list. What happens though is when you hide something, we don't have a way to differentiate between sort of who are the people who should have access to that record and who are the people who should not. So we hide it for everybody. And so that means that the science community doesn't have access to it. So what I do is there's some things that I might hide for a little while. So I'm going to go in and hide this. What you'll see on the left side here, I'm trying to circle this, is it says checklist flag hidden checklist. This is a way now, and I go on this, I know that other people aren't able to see this list anymore. If I go back into checklist tools at the end of the breeding season or something like that, I could go back in here and then show an eBird output. And now that message that was over here on the left side is gone. So you can also go in and we understand that there isn't sort of one uniform way to do this. So this is sort of the things that we're trying to balance. And that sensitive species article, I mean, I've already talked a lot, I think, on this topic, but that does go into a lot more examples. It's a super good question.
Yeah, that's real helpful for the nests because I don't want to report them when they're active because people will try to come and see them and it's not good.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Catherine Young asks for tracks. Isn't it only available for the people on the checklist? I could not go in and look at someone else's track, could I?
Great question. Yeah, currently the way that we've set that up, because there's privacy concerns, Margie's shared with some of her 100 best friends that she's trespassing to go look at swallow-tailed kites. It's okay for Margie to out herself, but we want to make sure we take privacy really, really seriously. And so within eBird, and I just want to show this so that people can see this, there's this preference section. If you go up and you click on your name and you click on preferences, there's a lot of options for how you choose to share your information with the community. And so you can change, if you want to just be anonymous, you can say that you want to be anonymous. You can choose to hide your data. So if you're concerned about, another thing is if you're doing a lot of surveys during the nesting season or something like that, you can just choose to hide your data from recent visit, hide it from the eBird alerts, hide some of your comments. There's other ways that you can do things that then they're still available to the science community. What we want to do is build out a way in here that allows people to opt into sharing those checklist tracks if they want to. And in the long run, what we'd like to do is maybe say, okay, maybe there's a group of people that you'd want to share those tracks with, but maybe not with everybody. And so you'd be able to do something like that. So that's why we haven't yet, we don't yet have that ability because we don't want to just sort of force everybody into something they may not want to do.
Well, the questions just keep rolling in. You still okay with more?
Oh yeah, I love this.
All right. So
Are you?
Barbara's Zeidel asks, how is spurious data identified and ruled out?
So spurious in what sense?
She doesn't say, but I can think of examples, where they're wise asses and they put some floofy bird that doesn't exist. And
yeah. So there's a few different ways, and I'll show this. So remember when I was going into the review tools and showing this page, sort of the unusual stuff. Let's look at one of the filters. And so there are, these are all the, if I type in Florida here, these are the various filters that we have, and they're mostly county-based. So if I go into Manatee County, this is basically the maximum number of birds you can report before something is flagged. So if you report something like, Bufflehead's an example of something that's sort of right on the edge of rarity. Like there's a handful that are around in the winter, but they're rare enough that it's worth having a couple notes in there. If you report that, that's sort of an outlier that we'll see. There's other ways where what I'm going to do, this is something that's coming in the future that has to do specifically with photographs. And let me think how I want to do this. I'm going to go into Explore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find a checklist of mine with a lot of photos. So I'm going to go into Explore. I'm going to click on Search Photos and Sounds. And in this Search Photos and Sounds, one of the options is for me just to look at my media if I click on this. So this is sorted by sort of recent stuff, shiny cowbirds. I'll look at some of my higher quality images and hope to go to something where there's a bunch, where I think that there's going to be a lot of photos. So this one might have a lot of photos. When I go into manage my media here, one of the things that, okay, there we go, that's showing up is you can see that there's this green checkbox that says there's a 99% chance this is rufous-breasted hermit. Some of the computer vision models that are working in Merlin we're starting to play with. So this is something that the rest of you are not going to see this. This is something that I see because I'm Jesse's husband and she runs this stuff. So I'm helping test this. And you can see that with some of these things where there's a weird angle, this is saying that this might be green thorntail. It's not, it's a racket-tipped thorntail. So we're still sort of working out sort of what confidence level. These are pretty low confidence, 17%, 68%. So we wouldn't want to show those. But this is another direction that we're moving in, because one of the best misidentifications I've ever had is when I dragged over a photo of a red whiskered bulbul down from Kendall. I accidentally dragged it over into red winged blackbird instead of red whiskered bulbul. And then Bill Pranty sent me a very snide message that said, well, Chris, let me hold your hand and help you identify and learn the different subtleties between red whiskered bulbul and red-winged blackbird. That was embarrassing for me. And we're trying to build things that sort of, and these things just happen. Like I promise if anybody on this phone call, I've misidentified more birds maybe than all of the rest of you put together, because I spend a ton of time looking at birds. And that's part of the process. That's how we get better. So don't stress out too much if you make some misidentifications.
Oh, you made me feel so much better.
Yeah, all of us are going to make some ID mistakes, and just be open to when somebody writes with a comment. Those are I've learned that feedback on identifications really is a gift, and it's how we learn. And so part of what we're trying to do is think, how do we build a community where we can learn from each other?
So Sue Whiting wants to know, are old records that I have from before eBird of interest to eBird, often no numbers were recorded?
Absolutely. That's an easy one. Yes. Good.
Tom Littoral asks, will eBird allow cinching for all devices someday?
Yeah, that's
sorry.
Thinking. Yeah, and I'm good. Yeah, we hope to. And what it is there's a trade-off. We want to think about sort of what are the cases where syncing is most useful. So Tom, actually, if you want to sort of shoot me a message at chris.wood@cornell.edu to let me know sort of where are the cases where it's most important. Because one of the issues is for instance, I have 158 megs worth of data in my account, and sort of constantly syncing those back and forth to look for changes and updates can use a lot of bandwidth, particularly, you know, if you're sort of out at Duet, let's say, and you're trying to submit a checklist and we're trying to sync at that time, there's just a bunch of things to sort of work through. So we're trying to think through what are the data that are most important to sync between different devices so that it's going to be most useful for you, as opposed to just sort of syncing everything across. Is sort of the challenge there.
Anonymous attendee asks, rangers in Maine national parks tell us that climate change is affecting long distance migrators more than short distance ones. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, generalizations are hard. And I would say that they're affecting them in different ways. But I'm not sure I would say more necessarily. They may be affecting them in a detrimental way more. I could see an argument for that. But so one of the things is that short distance migrants, and these are going to be some generalizations which I tend not to like to make. But short distance migrants often have some quote unquote insight over time to or through natural selection to quote unquote understand or adapt to different biological processes. So I wouldn't say necessarily that that the climate change is affecting them more. I think it's probably affecting a lot of birds that in a lot of different ways. But what happens is that long distance migrants, it may be harder for them to respond to those changes than short distance migrants, because short distance migrants, you know, they may be able to compensate for that by flying a bit less from one year to the next. And they sort of could be more adaptable. And it gets very challenging because, you know, you have something like Canada geese or American robins or cedar waxwings that are sort of more facultative, which is that they're sort of responding to the conditions that year. And then there's other things like very long distance migrants. So neotropical migrants, I think, are sort of a classic example of this. They may be less able to respond, but even within the level of a species, those changes can really differ based on different populations. And so an example of that I'll point to is in one of the most amazing birds in the world that you don't see very often here, Hudsonian godwit. There is a student, PhD student at Cornell Nate Center who did a lot of work to really dive into this in a lot of detail. And there's two principal areas. This is a simplification, but there's two main areas in sort of where they're breeding. One of those are breeding in sort of the Churchill Hudson Bay area. There's another population that's breeding in Alaska. And a lot of these birds are wintering in, you know, Chile, sort of southern Chile on the coast of Chile, 8,000 miles away. And those birds fly north in the spring. And they basically fly nonstop for several days, keep flying, and unless they're hit by some major storm, those birds could go all the way up. Sometimes they'll land in rice fields in you know, Texas or Louisiana, but they could also go all the way up to the rainwater basin of Nebraska. And one may hypothesize then that when those birds are staging there, the trigger that allows those birds to migrate between there and Alaska and there and the Hudson Bay, those triggers are different for those different individuals. And when Nate sort of dove into this in quite a bit of detail, the birds that were flying a great distance, you know, all the way from sort of North Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, from that area, all the way over to sort of Anchorage area of Alaska, those birds were using what the conditions were the previous year to initiate that flight. And because those changes have sort of been somewhat more gradual and the warming has taken place in a consistent way, it's been dramatic. And it's shifted by 10 days within the last 20 years or something. They've been consistent. That's a very, very different pattern than what's happening in Churchill. In Churchill, you have wild fluctuations from one year to the next. So those birds are using the conditions in North Dakota to try to give some insight into what's happening in Churchill. Usually that works pretty well, right? They're close to each other, they're affected by the sort of same. And so over thousands of years, hundreds, thousands of years, those processes have diverged in these two different populations. Arguably, this is the process of sort of speciation sort of taking place. If that's going to continue for a long time, those could be different species eventually. But what's happening in Churchill also is that the changes are so dramatic within a year that you now go from 3 feet of snow in Churchill in 4 days to 80 degrees and the hatch of the mosquitoes. And the time that those birds have to adapt is just not, it's not sufficient. And they're not able to, so they're doing a lot of the courting. You see this in shorebirds, this is one of the great things as you watch this spring, really even now, like start watching ducks, start watching the red-breasted mergansers, they may start courting, buffleheads may start courting. They're not going to nest anywhere near here, but they're going to places sort of in the Arctic where they want to they want to establish pair bonds. They want to start courting sort of already when they're down here. And then when they get there, there's such a pressure for them to rapidly, pair, defend a territory, lay eggs and all that. And right now in Churchill, there just isn't the time for those birds. So season after season, they're laying eggs, they're getting young, but the young are not able to fledge and then fly these great distances. And so this is sort of one specific case of sort of one long distance migrant that even shows sort of the complexity in that individual species of sort of unwrapping this. Wes Hachachka, who's this brilliant ecologist on our team, he says that the work that they do is not rocket science. It's a hell of a lot harder because rocket science is just physics. It's some advanced math. Figuring this out, you have these interaction effects of, how the conditions of birds in Chile are affecting the birds, and those are called carryover effects. And so I know this was a question having to do with long distance versus short distance migrants. This is why scientists often, can't answer a question with sort of a simple yes, no. It's that there's a lot of complexity, and it's really hard to have these generalizations. But if we were to say, I could say that in general, yes, long distance migrants are having a harder time adapting to climate change than short distance migrants. If we were to make some very big generalizations that cause bubbles in my Katuzi.
Okay, one final question here. Kathy Doddridge wants to know, she knows there's an option to do a CBC checklist for multiple sites with iPhone. How about on Android?
Wait, say that one more time, sorry.
Sure. There's an option to create a CBC checklist for multiple sites with iPhone. Will there be one for Android?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, there's sort of this reports functionality on iPhone where you can sort of aggregate several different lists based on the date and time. And that report will not exist in Android. What will exist is sort of this new reporting mechanism that I was talking about, which is going to be ways of aggregating data in much better ways than sort of that. The reason we're not building that in Android is we actually think the functionality in the iPhone is pretty embarrassing and pretty bad. So instead of sort of putting the effort to create something that's sort of equally bad, we want to just build the next thing, which is sort of the reporting thing that I was talking about before. So thanks for your patience. The one good thing about Android is that's the development platform where the things are released first. So when sort of new functionality is added for mobile devices, Android always does get it first. So that's the one little present we give you that you have. That was a lame answer.
Chris, you're awesome. I can't believe how helpful this is, and the response, the number of questions is just amazing. And I appreciate your being so conscientious and thoughtful and sharing your thought process. This is really moving. I'm just so grateful that you're speaking with us tonight. So thank you so much. I wanted to, I hope you'll be here for more speakers. We're going to have a gentleman speaking about panthers on February 8th, which is next Monday, and the Florida Panthers and what their future looks like here. And then on the 24th of February, we're going to have someone from New Zealand talking about Polynesia and how unbelievably it turns out the islands within Polynesia were settled by one island of humans going by non-instrument navigation, following the birds among other signs, and following the migrating birds, and realize, oh, there's land there. So then they would settle a next group of islands. So he's going to go into the details of that and also review for us in modern times how the ancients actually navigated from island to island without using GPS or any of these things. So please join us. And I think, Karen, you want to take it away?
Yes. One other thing related to eBird. Catherine Young, our education director, is going to, on March 24th, give us a talk on how to use eBird. So just kind of the basics. Yeah. So stay tuned, March 24th. All right. I think that's it. So
Thank
What
you,
an
Chris.
Thank you
It's
so much
great. Thank you so
for this.
much.
This is a real treat for me. I think Jesse's maybe on deck to do something with Merlin later, and we're always happy to answer questions about sort of any kind of thing you'd like. So it was a treat for us. Thank you so much.
Thank
Great.
you so much.
thanks. All right.
Bye. Take